Hi, this is John Romano, and I'm recording this lecture, Early Africa, from my course, World Civilization to 1500. In this lecture, I'm particularly going to be dealing with the history of Africa from its earliest origins to right around the year 1000. And here I'm just showing you the modern-day continent of Africa on a political map. It's fair to say, though, for the period of this lecture, that Africa itself moved to very different patterns from some of the other civilizations that we've been studying. And really, the vast majority of what is known as sub-Saharan Africa, so the Africa underneath the Sahara, to the south of the Sahara, really is barely affected by some of these various storms, you might say, to the north. And really, to a very large degree, sub-Saharan Africa remained outside of these mainstream cultural developments. And equally, there really were no world-changing events that issued forth from the Africa of this time. The contacts that we know of from Africa of this time with outsiders tended largely to be marked by trade. And then with the coming of Islam, there was the gradual spread of missionaries in this area. But we're really talking, by and large, about small-scale encounters with outsiders. And there are at least some scholars who feel that Africa is not really fully sucked into the currents of world history until the late 19th century, when there really is extensive engagement, especially with Western Europe. So, in effect, that is a period, of course, that is far outside of what we're studying in this class. Part of the problem with studying Africa in this period, of course, many are interested in learning more about it, but really the sources present a really quite a few difficulties that we ought to first discuss. And really the isolation from other civilizations mean that for much of the story of Africa's history, we have to depend on archaeological evidence. Here I'm showing you, just as one of many examples, the ruins of what is known as Kumbi Saleh, that is the former capital of what is known as the Ghana Empire. Now, I'll talk more about the Ghana Empire later, but here I'm just showing you what some of these archaeological remains look like. And you can see how they really, on the one hand, are tantalizing, as to they give us some idea of the kind of buildings that people occupied in the civilization, the building techniques, perhaps just some idea of the density of people who could have lived in this area. But in terms of what actually once happened in these buildings, we really have no idea just by looking at this physical evidence. Another form of source that people often use for early Africa is cave art. And to discuss that a little bit, I'm going to point out one example known as the Tassili Mountains in modern-day Algeria. Now, we've already seen rock art in this class, and of course, we're very lucky to have it when we have it for certain civilizations, and no less so here in the Tassili Mountains. So to give you some idea of what kinds of paintings we're talking about, here, of course, is a woman. Here's this kind of monstrous creature who looms over, something like an antelope, perhaps. Something like an antelope here. People on the hunt. Again, very similar motifs to the kind of cave art, for instance, that we see in the Lascaux caves. Here's a sleeping antelope. Part of the difficulty with this rock art is that its dating is really is very difficult to nail down very well. To give you some idea how imprecise the dating is here, some of this rock art has been dated anywhere between 8,000 BCE and the early part of the Common Era. And this span of around 8,000 years is unusable from a historical perspective, because I can't relate it to anything else that was happening outside of the caves when this art was created. So it does tell us something about the kind of artwork that was produced, but we don't know when and by whom exactly. There are also other examples of art, in particular carvings and sculpture, that people often draw upon to speak about early Africa. To give you one example, this is one sculpture from what is known as the Nok Culture from modern-day northern Nigeria. And you can see the kinds of things that were produced in the Nok culture. These kind of terracotta figures. Terracotta, of course, is a form of clay, and sometimes just heads. And you can see again, they're really famed for their these kind of elongated forms. Here's a woman from the Nok culture. Here's a man perhaps riding a horse or hippopotamus. The great problem, too, with the Nok culture is that we have a very imprecise idea of when these were made. I think the estimates have been from anywhere from 900 BCE to around 200 CE. And we also have no idea of why these were made. Were these things that were art for art's sake? Were they meant to have some sort of religious meaning? We simply really don't know how they fit into the civilization that produced them. I should say, though, especially with the Nok culture, though, especially in more recent years, they've actually been collected by people who just out of love of their beauty. Even people have no desire to study that from a scholarly purpose. Very few of the sources we have were written at all, and even those ones that we have that are written tended not to be interested in Africa for its own sake. Now, to give you some idea of what I mean, let me give you just one example of a very interesting kind of written source that we have for early Africa, something known as a periplus. Here in this image, it's just someone has actually mapped out the different place locations that are listed in this written source, and the kind of information that is given for each place name, many of which, for our purposes, are the most important, are of course on the west coast of Africa. This source, a periplus, the translation of it from Greek means sailing around. And what you can see here, in fact, that it describes very well what these sources are. The periplus, before you go ahead and map it out like this, is really just a list of different places that you could sail around to on the coast of various places. The purpose of the periplus was not some sort of a cultural examination of Africa. What it was intended to do was to tell you as a sailor and a merchant where you should go to trade for certain items. Where could you find certain things that you needed to buy? The people, merchants who were trading with the Africans at the time, must have had some kind of observations about them, but if they did, they chose not to record them, because that really was not the purpose that they were writing down these sources in the first place. They just wanted to know, from a business perspective, what they could get. Another kind of source that sometimes people try to exploit to be able to figure out early African history are anthropological reports, especially, for instance, from Western Europeans and Americans who starting especially in the 19th century, would attempt to go to certain places in Africa, especially ones ideally that had not previously been explored, and to observe the way of the life of the people that they saw. And these often, by the way, are quite useful to us to this day to expand our knowledge of what people in these areas were doing, and really, in some cases, provide some idea of a way of life that has simply ceased to be in the meantime. The problem with using these sources, though, to discuss a much earlier period of African history is that you have to rely on the assumption that people were always the same in these civilizations across a period of centuries. And that is not an assumption that most people are willing to make. You wouldn't, for instance, go to modern-day Italy and hope to learn about how people lived in the Roman Empire. And the same is true, of course, for Africa, different areas in Africa. What this means is that much of ancient African history is an obscure business. And really, most people tend to think you can only sketch the barest outlines of their history. And occasionally we can use the sources we have in creative ways. One very interesting source, for instance, is that some scholars have looked at legends of migration in Africa. And although many of these legends are very far removed from reality, one thing that people have noticed is that they always talk about people traveling in the same direction, from the north to the south, and also to the west to some degree, which makes us think that even though most of the stories were legendary, there is a core of truth in the direction of migration. And we do think, for the most part, African culture seems to have been both enriched and elaborated in the north first, and then in the south much later. Along these lines, it's important to note one of the important limiting factors for African history, which is the environment. And here I'm just showing you a physical map of Africa to give you some idea of that. And what will strike you immediately is the diversity of African geography. In both the north and the southwest, there are significant deserts, large portions of which are uninhabitable. Right, in much of the north and the south, you will see this kind of setting known as a savanna, these kind of open woodlands and grassy plains, and where normally only, for instance, they really get water one time a year. And right around the equator, you tend to get these areas, rainforests. Virtually all of these areas, it is very difficult to live in, so there's significant challenges of the environment. Really, much of the continent's history, many people think, are attempts to incorporate things from the outside that make it more possible to be able to live and to battle against the environment. So bringing in ironworking and new crops from the Middle East, and much later on, steam engines and medicine from Western Europe. And without some of these things, really Africans south of the Sahara had to really deal with these huge pressures from geography, climate, and disease. These sort of challenges mean that the kind of sources that remain are few and far between. As you can see, sometimes, again, as with many hunter-gatherer peoples, you will get various stones that have been worked to be able to attack animals, for instance, or other people. Many people, we think, whose lives we really can't record very well, tended to be practice a form of hunting, shifting agriculture. They tended not to be tied to any one particular area. And as we've seen elsewhere, this kind of life of hunting-gathering tends to be one in which people tend not to be able to survive very well, and as a whole, population tended to stay relatively small. This way of life also meant that in certain places, especially the southern you go, people did not necessarily arrive at the wheel for a long time, and without the wheel, of course, it's very difficult to handle questions about transportation, milling, creating pottery. All of these are hard without the wheel. All right. What then can we actually say in more concrete terms about sub-Saharan Africa in this period? Well, any historical conversation about sub-Saharan Africa begins with the mysterious sub-Saharan kingdom known as Kush, which is shown here on this map. It is really the first independent African state other than Africa about which we have real information. And if you look on this map, you'll see that Kush is high up on the Nile. And in fact, of course, this ties Kush very closely with its great neighbor, Egypt. And really, the areas of Kush were the extreme frontier zone of Egyptian activity. We have evidence, in fact, that many ancient Egyptians chose to go to Kush to be able to mine, especially for precious minerals like gold. And in fact, some ancient Egyptians simply chose to stay in Kush, to settle in Kush, to be able to effectuate that trade, although really only in modest numbers. And we really see that in time, this cultural interaction is going to mean that Kush is going to take a lot from ancient Egyptian civilization, and especially if you see here, they actually they create their own kingship, but it is marked by things from ancient Egypt, like for instance, you can see these form of pyramids on a much smaller scale that were created in Kush. We also see that in Kush they will create their own form of hieroglyphs based upon the example of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, or form of writing. In fact, also by the year 730 BCE, Kush as a kingdom was strong enough to actually conquer Egypt. And in fact, there was a period of time where 5 of the kings of Kush would also serve as pharaohs of Egypt simultaneously. Nonetheless, we think that these kings run into some of the exact same weaknesses that ancient Egypt in a later period does, and they really too cannot arrest the decline of Egyptian civilization in the face of some of these young, dynamic empires from the Middle East. And in essence, when the Assyrians come and invade Egypt, the kings in Kush decide more or less to pull out. And we're going to see then in time that Kush is going to increasingly begin to look less to the north and its Egyptian neighbors, and look more to the south and its sub-Saharan neighbors instead. And on the whole, we think, as time goes on, the prevalence of Egyptian trends and culture is going to drop. And really, in essence, what we're going to see instead is that the people of Kush are going to begin increasingly to trade and to fight with some of its African neighbors. And one of the reasons why Kush was, for a period of time, relatively successful with this process is that they were able to mine iron ore directly on their lands. And they were able to take that iron ore then and to shape it to create both weapons and agricultural tools as well. And really, for a period of time, Kush was actually the capital of metal production in sub-Saharan Africa. And we've already seen, of course, that once you have weapon, what that means in essence is that you are going to generally be more successful over some of your neighbors in battle. It also means that they were good at clearing lands and beginning to do more agriculture as well. And so this led to quite a period of around 300 years in which they had a relatively prosperous civilization. Again, I should caution you that we do not tend to see the knowledge of iron really necessarily spreading very quickly especially into some of the southernmost regions of Africa. There were still, even as Kush disseminated this technology to some of its closer neighbors, there were still some people who essentially were living hunter-gatherer existences further to the south as well. But for those people who did begin to have iron, that makes an absolutely huge difference in agriculture. And both for clearing forest initially and then tilling the soil. And we really see in effect that this does to some degree begin to open slightly new regions to a way of life that was more settled, was agricultural in nature rather than hunting and gathering. And what has sometimes confused people is that even after more people are turning to a way of life of agriculture in Africa, Africans still did not acquire the plow at this point. And really, this was likely not just a technological gap, but in effect, for most of the continents to the south of Egypt, at the time there was no animal that was resistant enough to African diseases to be able to draw a plow. So it really would have made relatively little sense to have brought these animals in that were just going to die anywhere. And in fact, one of the few places where we do see plows was Ethiopia, where these certain animals, like horses, could be bred successfully and they could stay alive. And that's not the only place. Other horses begin to be bred for riding, at least, in other portions of South Sahara. I should say before I move on that much of the history of Kush still waits to be uncovered. And really, we've only at this point excavated a few major cities. But on top of that, I can also talk about the sort of successor state, or the state that was eventually overthrew the people of Kush, and that is the civilization of Ethiopia. The next one we'll turn to. What is very interesting to us, and really when Ethiopia begins to burst on the scene, is that between the 4th and 5th centuries, the people of Ethiopia, so on the east coast of Africa, will convert to Christianity. And just to give you some idea, this is a victory pillar that was erected by one of the kings of Ethiopia. And what's interesting to us, it actually has an inscription attached with it. To some degree, this is most of this inscription is the kind of propaganda that we often see about kings, how they've defeated their enemies in battle, how many people they've killed, how many things that they've taken. But what is so interesting to us is that the God who is thanked in this inscription is Jesus, because at this point they had already converted by and large to Christianity. And not only did they convert to Christianity, but these kings had a very interesting kind of backstory that they created for themselves. The royal family of Ethiopia claims that in fact they have blood from the biblical King Solomon, who was said to have slept with the Queen of Sheba, who they claimed as their own. This, again, you can say that this is something of a mythical story, but it shows this desire to really tie themselves into the biblical story themselves. For centuries, the Ethiopians were the only Christian people in Africa outside of Egypt. Really, that was true even after the Muslim invasions that essentially would seal off Ethiopia from the rest of the Christian world. Because of its position on the water, we think that Ethiopia actually had quite a lively trading scene, a merchant scene at one point. It was at least one of the ports where people from further to the north could come to be able to get, for instance, exotic items from animals, like, for instance, ivory. We can see that very clearly Romans did come to Ethiopia to trade. This, for instance, is a Roman amphora, Roman pottery that was used to trade at this time. And it appears to us, too, that Ethiopians, their kings, get the idea to begin to mint coins really along the same lines as the Romans. So they begin to have a very similar kind of coinage. Really, for a very long period in sub-Saharan Africa, Ethiopia would remain as the only literate non-Islamic nation. They end up speaking a Semitic language, Amharic, that was related to Hebrew and Arabic. In effect, it was the only other place in Africa in which Christianity had established itself was that area in which Romans had been, which, as we've already said, that northern sort of strip in Africa ends up being conquered by Muslims, and in time, a good portion of the population will convert, but not so in Ethiopia. Moving on along a little bit, one of the other sources that's very precious to historians to talk about non-literate African societies in this period we're talking about here, will really rely upon Arab travel accounts. So Arab travelers, and usually merchants, who will come and trade with some of these areas. Really, in some cases, they will make note of normally the trading communities they come into contact with, these small cities that they village. Altogether, we think that as Arabs begin to come into some of these territories, as Muslims come into these territories, they really try their best to prop up certain areas, certain political regimes, and with the purpose of wanting to have stable trade partners. Really, we think that merchants tended to like stability. These Muslim merchants, when they went into sub-Saharan Africa, they wanted to know that they were going to be able to trade with the same people. They knew which leaders to flatter, and they wanted to make sure that these people stayed in power. It's really, we think that many of these sort of smaller kingdoms that begin to pop up in sub-Saharan Africa often gain a lot of their initial wealth, some of their initial encouragement, you might say, by Muslim traders. One good example of this trend is this kind of green splotch that appears here in the western part of northwestern Africa, which is known as the Ghana Empire. And you can see here, again, the capital city, Kumbi Saleh. For those of you playing along, this area is actually to the north of the modern-day state Ghana, which was named in honor of this historical empire. In terms of the origins of the Ghana Empire, we really know very little about them. Some people tend to think that those who had formed this empire had gained some supremacy over some of the surrounding peoples because they enjoyed the advantages of both iron weapons and horses. But again, really, we don't know exactly. And when Arab travelers begin for the first time to write about the Ghana Empire, it already was relatively extensive in size. It was already had some power. So we can't really see the process so much as the end result. At the greatest extent, the Ghana Empire spans an area of around 500 miles, and you can see, of course, that especially to the north, it ends up actually eventually touching close to the Sahara. And we do think, just to give you some idea, there's one village that pops up probably in building in stone as the result of the sustained interactions that they begin to have with Muslim merchants to the north. And it really is no mystery to us why so many Muslim caravans begin to make the long, difficult journey across the Sahara Desert to arrive at the Ghana Empire. And the very simple reason is that they felt that this area was a land of gold. And I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but this map gives you some idea of the different networks that grew up to bring gold from some of the mines and passing up to the north into the Muslim areas, and sometimes even from that point going further afield. And of course, gold is one of those luxury items that it really makes it worth it to travel all the way across the Sahara, even the difficult conditions there. Some of the other things that begin to become important in this in these kind of trading routes, in addition to gold, were first of all salt, which for this period is important for preservation of food. And another thing, already in this period, we're going to see that slaves already begin to be traded, although, as we'll see later on, the extent of the slave trade actually is going to go up even more in a later period. Now you'll notice from what we've been discussing that much of the examples I've been drawing from tend to really mass around the northern regions of sub-Saharan Africa. And as we move further in the south, really the further to the south you get, the more difficult it is for this period to say anything that's truly substantive. If I'm able to identify one trend that is particularly important for this time period for Africa, however, it is what is known as the Bantu migrations. Bantu was a group of people and a linguistic group. So essentially, the group of people who initially spoke this language, Bantu, were also we refer to as Bantu peoples. And you can see here in this little circle here where they come from initially, from modern-day Nigeria. And to make this story even a little bit more complicated, although this will start off as one language, in time Bantu is going to spread and become a series of different languages, all with some similar linguistic characteristics. So it eventually Bantu becomes similar to Romance languages, where all sorts of languages that derive from a similar ancestor. All right. So who are these Bantu peoples who, in this period, begin to migrate? In the trend, you can largely see here, where they start out here, and eventually they will spread to the vast portion of the inhabitable portions of the southernmost regions of Africa. The people in this area, the earliest Bantu speakers in Nigeria, would settle along the banks of rivers, and they appeared to be very good at creating canoes and using these canoes to then go to open areas of the region's forests. Bantu peoples were agriculturalists. They cultivated yams and millet, and they also kept goats as well. Altogether, we tend to think the Bantu people lived in clan-based villages, so villages in which family was very important, one's blood, and they were headed essentially by patriarchs of the group, of chiefs, more or less. We think that Bantu peoples would trade regularly with peoples further to the south who remained hunter-gatherers, people who lived in some of the tropical forest further to the south. And we think that the Bantu peoples who were able to provide them with finished products, like, for instance, they gave these forest peoples pottery, stone axes, for instance, and in exchange they would receive meat, honey, and various other items from the forest with some of these people they traded with. And we think that the way of life of agriculture, as we've seen previously, in comparison with hunting-gathering, really meant that the population of these Bantu peoples begins to go up significantly. And in fact, in their original homelands, they actually begin to feel population pressure. There are too many people for too little land. Well, the thing is that because the Bantu had already had seemingly this tradition of trading and going to and using their canoes to be able to travel further to the south, there was a logical way to deal with this problem, which is to say that they use their canoes and they begin to migrate to the south, pushing down further to the south until they found an area, a new settlement on an inviting spot on the riverbanks. And this process that I've just described seems to have happened again and again. An agricultural surplus leads to a lot more Bantu peoples, and they reproduce. Then again, when one area begins to become too crowded, then they decide that it's time to leave the parent community, and they push down, and then they found a new territory. And whereas it seems that first some of the areas along rivers were populated, then in time they will begin to move inland. And at least in some cases, what previously had been relatively peaceful interactions with some of the forest dwellers changed into warfare with them. And in these battles, the Bantu had, because they had a much more finished products, we think that they had things like, for instance, iron weapons to be able to fight with their enemies, to fight successfully against them. And again, they had iron weapons, not just for war, but then they also had iron tools to be able then to do agriculture. And we can really see that eventually that this Bantu language, and the Bantu way of life together begins to push and begins to spread over the majority of southern Africa. And it's actually quite interesting that this is one of those cases in which our primary evidence for this migration is actually linguistic in nature. And in fact, I had mentioned to you earlier again that Bantu is not just one tongue now. And in fact, it actually is 500 different but related languages, meaning that in today's world, around 90 million people speak a language, one of these Bantu languages that's related to this initial Bantu population. In terms of what kind of government ends up being set up in some of these regions, we think that that for the most part, we think that some of these new Bantu villages that grow up very quickly will be very simple in nature, just as in probably their initial homeland. Their politics really did not have large-scale organizations, large bureaucracy, massive standing armies, or anything like that. We really see very small-scale areas in which family was likely important, certain patriarchs, and probably the power of these states was limited by custom, by respect for tradition, and probably also a lack of resources. Altogether, we tend to. This is probably one of the reasons why many of these very small-scale governments probably were transitory and fleeting. We really don't see a whole lot of evidence for them after a certain period. Now on to this image. The last topic I want to deal with a little bit here is a question of the broader religious background of Africa in this early period. Now, I had already mentioned to you that in this period, the only African state that had embraced Christianity was Ethiopia. We also see that, as I had mentioned to you earlier, in the sort of strip in northern Africa, we of course see a lot more Islam once the invasions take place, and we see also that Muslim missionaries will actually make their way to some of the territories of sub-Saharan Africa, and we really see, again, very often missionaries will come with some of these merchants to try to convert people to Islam. And at least for some rulers in sub-Saharan Africa and elite people, they will actually convert to Islam. But it is clear to us, though, that even from those places where that occurs, that in some cases the conversion to Islam was half-hearted, and in other cases, many lower-class people really do not embrace Islam at all, where they just keep their local religious traditions. That, of course, opens the question about what exactly were people's religious traditions before this point, if really only a small minority of people were either Christian or Muslim. You'll be unhappy to learn that, again, our knowledge is quite limited about the arena of religion. Perhaps the easiest statement to make is very likely their religious beliefs varied considerably from place to place and from time to time. One of the perhaps most obvious statements that one could make is that there was some kind of belief in that there were spirits or gods out there. Very broadly speaking, these spirits or gods were responsible for creation, and they did indeed interact with humans. One of the primary means of interaction with gods or spirits could come through the natural world, which in turn often led to respect for the natural world and what it could tell you about the god's desires or your ability to get in touch with the gods. It was thought that at least some special people, priest-like people, had the power to interact with gods or spirits through rituals. Again, various rituals, sometimes involving, for instance, meditation, altered states of reality, where they could come in touch with the spirit. So they had powers to do so that ordinary people did not. Eventually, when Europeans come in contact, they will sometimes refer to these people as medicine men, because sometimes the same people who served in the role of priests could also dispense medicine to people as well. Altogether, we think that these African gods or spirits could reward people, or they could punish them. So, for instance, if you carried out the appropriate rituals, they could, for instance, guarantee the harvest would do well. They would protect the interests of the ruler and his subjects. And if you, on the other side of the token, is that if you chose to neglect the gods or spirits, then they could have a very adversarial relationship with one. They could punish one by death, destruction of harvests, these kinds of things. If there is a key element to some of the African religion in this period that perhaps set aside from at least some religious traditions, it is that there was really a weight probably placed on importance to ancestors. That in fact, it was actually it was good not to just get in touch with the major gods or spirits, but also with the spirits of dead ancestors. Who could also be touched through certain rituals. The reason for this was simple: that these dead ancestors would have a closeness with others in their family. They wanted to see their descendants continue to do well, and so, in fact, they would be interested in helping. From the worldly side, this actually would be much easier to get into to contact, interact with people who had come from the same family, rather than just some general spirits, because you were familiar with them. This should point to the fact that we do think very broadly that there was some belief in something like an afterlife, that souls continue to exist, or would have made very little sense to attempt to get in touch with people after their deaths. I again will close on a note of caution about this discussion about religion, because from what little we know, very likely there was a great variety, and not everyone held the exact same beliefs, and probably with religion, like politics, everything was local, so it's very hard to speak in general terms, but I tried to do so anyway. All right, that's it. Thank you.